Amen. All right, we are Exodus chapter 19. And I tell you, this is one of those sections that I've been worried about because I have no clue how you finish 19 through 24 in one class, and I've done so good this quarter staying on track. But we'll see. No promises in tonight's class because there are such incredible things to talk about in this section of Scripture. So, Exodus chapter 19, we're actually going to camp out in 19 for a little bit, just because I think there are so many incredible ideas and applications really for us as we think about worshiping God and what is involved in that and how we worship God in a better way. So we've come through chapter 18, which was they're essentially camped out there at Mount Sinai. Moses is judging the people. They're kind of finding their identity, finding their purpose, finding their community of sorts. And in chapter 19, we got this great story of them coming to know God in a bigger way. And so we've got right here, in the third month, from the very day that the Israelites left the land of Egypt, they came to the Sinai wilderness. Verse 3, Moses went up on the mountain to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, "This is what you must say to the house of Jacob," and explain to the Israelites. "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all of the peoples, although the whole earth is mine, and you will be my kingdom, a priest and my holy nation." These are the words you are to say to the Israelites. All right, so let's stop there because that's already packed pretty full of some things we probably need to talk about. So first of all, I do find it interesting that we are giving a very specific time reference. This is probably the most specific time reference we've had thus far in Scripture. Okay, why is that? Why do you think? Do what? Okay, so you'll find as you go through Scripture that oftentimes when the more specific the time reference, the more important the event is that is about to happen. It's putting a time stamp on something. Okay, it is putting a very specific historical marker in place so that there is no question not only when it happened, but that it happened. And Moses is making sure that the people understand this was a real event and an important event. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, now let's move on to talk about the important event. Moses goes before God, and God essentially says what? Put it in your own words.
If you'll obey me, I will be your God, and be my people, and take care of you.
That's right. And here the emphasis is less on obeying, we're going to get to that, but more on God's side of the deal, right? I'm going to be their God. So look at what I've already done. What has he done? Brought them out of Egypt. And how is that worded? Okay, on eagle's wings. Okay, I brought you out of Egypt. I carried you on eagles. Now, literally, eagle's wings. They rode on eagles. This is like Lord of the Rings, jumping on the back of the giant eagles and flying. That, by the way, this is probably very much where J.R.R. Tolkien got that idea. He was very biblically based in a lot of the things that he wrote. So, but that idea of here, why does he say it this way? Why is God talking this way? Swift and powerful. Okay, this was a remarkable and an amazing event. That God brought them out of Egypt. God did so decisively. God did so by his mighty hand. And that idea of this was entirely something God did for them. This was not something they did for themselves. They did not earn getting out of Egypt. They did not fight their way out of Egypt. They played little to no role in it whatsoever other than putting their trust in God, right? And that this phrase, I carried you out on eagle's wings, is essentially that idea of God did it, and God is the one responsible for it. So God has earned the right to make the agreement that he's about to make, which is, I'm choosing you. I'm choosing you out of all the peoples in the entire world. The whole world is God's. He makes that point here. Like, he could choose anybody he wants. And honestly, everybody already belongs to him anyway. But he's not just choosing them to be their God. What is he choosing them to do? What's the job he's giving them to do? To be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Okay? I think we miss that sometimes when we're thinking about the Israelite people. The Israelite people actually had a purpose. The Israelite people were to be the priest for the world, not just for themselves. Okay? We don't think of them that way. We think of them as their own little subset group of people who lived in a little small section of the world. They kept to themselves. Nobody messed with them. They didn't mess with anybody else, right? That's not the way God presents this. God says, you will be my kingdom of priests, not my kingdom that has some priest. Okay? Isn't that the way we normally think about it? They were to be a kingdom of priests. They were to essentially be the connection point between the world and God. How good did they do on that job? Not so great, right? Like that, again, that's not how we remember them as a people. So they were to be the kingdom of priests, and they were to be a holy nation. That was the agreement. That's what God wanted them to be. Okay, verse 7, Moses came back. He summoned the elders of these people. He set before them all the words that the Lord had commanded him. Then all the people responded together, we will do all that the Lord has spoken. And so Moses brings those words back to the Lord. Okay, now again, we already noted they don't really do all that the Lord has spoken. And at this point, God hasn't given them a lot of specifics. Okay, next section I really want us to focus in on. Okay, somebody read verse 9 down through 13. Okay, so now we're getting a kind of a presentation of God. God is essentially saying, I'm going to show myself to the people for two reasons. One is, I want the people to know that I really am speaking through you. So part of this is a confirmation of Moses, right? So God's going to be in a dense cloud. They're going to hear God's voice. And they're going to know that these words that Moses is sharing with them are God's words, right? Why is that important? Why is that important? Okay, yeah. So, and on top of that their confidence can be placed in Moses, right? I mean, Moses is going to be their leader for the next 40 years, right? They're 3 months into this. It's only been 3 months since they left Egypt, right? So they've only got 3 months of experience so far. How often is it, as you look forward in the story, that they doubt Moses? Quite often, right? Even his own brother and sister struggle with the idea that Moses was chosen as the primary mouthpiece of God. So God is, right from the get-go, I mean, can you imagine how much worse it would have been had they not truly had confidence that God was behind Moses? That Moses could have been making all this up, right? I mean, they're not up there on the mountain with him, right? And so I think it's important, before God gives Moses the law, that Moses is verified in the eyes of the people as God's spokesman. Okay, and so God's going to accomplish that here. And then God also says, so I'm also going to show myself to the people. Not literally, but he's going to show some of his qualities to the people. And we'll see that those qualities really will emphasize his power and his authority. And that's intentionally what God wants them to see at this point. And so here we've got that being essentially what's going to happen. Now, Moses comes down from the mountain. He consecrates them, okay? Now, how important is that? They need to be prepared before they come before God. They need to be prepared before, because this is a solemn occasion. It is an important occasion. And then on the third day, when the morning came, here's what we've got. Verse 16. There was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people in the camp shuddered. I imagine the trumpet sound being kind of like they always say when you hear a tornado, what's it sound like? A train, and even like a train horn coming. That same idea. They didn't have trains back then. They had trumpets. So same idea of just I don't know that there's literally a trumpet being blown on the edge of heaven, as much as that is a natural phenomenon of intense weather. And so you see that being what's happening here. So they hear the trumpet sound, so that all the people in the camp shuddered. Now, don't let that little detail pass you by. How significant or how powerful was this display? Very powerful. Yeah. Well, and you see that particularly once they hear God's voice, then they're really terrified. Yep. Yeah, Hebrews 12 and the story there about what they see on the mountain of God, and if that was terrifying, that God could shake mountains, how much more terrifying is it when we know God can essentially crumble the earth? That whole idea, like Ron said, that's being used elsewhere. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now again, how many times have we mentioned so far that God is introducing himself to this people? Okay, this is their official meeting. They've had a few text conversations, right? They've seen some photos, but this is their first date, right? I mean, that's essentially what's going on here. They are truly coming to realize who God is here, okay? So they stood at the mountain. Mount Sinai was completely enveloped in smoke because the Lord came down on it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. Whew. Man, it's amazing. If I remember correctly, if you remember back during our storytelling thing that we did, where we had kind of we had all the people getting up. And do y'all remember the Sinai part where we put the thunder and lightning up on the screen and all that, and we had the sounds going? And like, I still remember that. I'm like, that was so cool. Could you imagine being at the real thing? Right? I mean, how many times have you been stopped in your tracks by lightning or even a picture of lightning? Right? And just how amazing it is to see just several strikes of lightning. In Florida, my favorite thing in Florida is heat lightning, as we call it, which I know isn't really a thing. But you see lightning in the clouds, and it's wild. Like it's striking all the time in the cloud, and it's just incredible to in Florida sit on a porch and watch that in a distance, right? At camp this year, because we had a lot of rain at camp. On Saturday, I think it was Saturday, might have been, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Saturday. We had a big storm come through, and I was standing down with a few other staff members in a pavilion where you and I were working. We were finishing up that, and lightning struck not far away. And I mean, every single one of us hit the deck. Like it was so loud and powerful and sudden, right? Now, could you imagine all of that, all the thunder attached to it at the same time? So you've got that kind of power that we see on a probably not a very common basis, but I mean, we've seen it more this year than previous years. But on top of that, the entire mountain is on fire and smoke is going everywhere. I mean, just the immense amount of sound and sensory experience that would have made for the people. I have a hard time wrapping my brain around just how incredible that would have been. So the Lord comes, he summons Moses up to the top of the mountain. So Moses goes up. I bring that up because imagine how long that took. Now God could have zipped him away, but God doesn't. He goes all the way up the mountain, and God has a conversation with him. Go down, warn the people not to break through to see the Lord, otherwise many of them will die. Even the priests who come near the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out in his anger against them. Note, what priest? You ever thought about that? Like, what priest? So God's saying, don't let the priests come up, but there are no priests yet. Okay? I just bring that up because that doesn't mean there aren't priests. What that means is we don't understand what was set up and what was in place before God rearranged and redid some things. We just don't have all the information. But there clearly was some sort of religious practice toward God, even at this early stage before God redesigned it and set up the Levitical priesthood and all of that through Aaron and everybody else. So, do what? And Jethro was, it's very likely there could have been others even among their own ranks. Lisa? Maybe. I tend to think he's speaking of, because the way that's worded, don't let anybody come, not even the priest. As if there were some who might have felt they had the right to approach as opposed to everybody else. So I tend to think probably, just like Jethro was a priest, there were priests outside of the Levitical priesthood. So it's very likely that even among this group of people, as they had a relationship with God of some sort, they didn't know God yet, but these priests, the priest of the Most High, they weren't even allowed to come up because God was going to redesign all of that anyway. So, Dallas?
Really ever thought about that before either, but these were the descendants of Abraham to whom God spoke, Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac.
Yeah.
And they were maybe believers in God, even though they were in captivity for 400 years.
Yeah.
Maybe priests had evolved there.
Yeah, maybe so. And again, I think knowing that there is Jethro, who seems to be a priest of God, it seems very likely that even among the descendants of Abraham, there could have been priests. They're just not, it's not part of the law, part of the story we have. But I've always, again, I've just thought that was interesting that even the priests aren't allowed to come up, or God will break out in his anger. Moses responded, the people cannot come up on Mount Sinai since you warned us, put a boundary stone. The Lord said, go down, come back with Aaron, and the priest and the people must not break through to come to the Lord, or he will break out in anger against them. So Moses went down and told the people. So how many times at this point has God emphasized, do not come up on the mountain? Several, right? 3, maybe 4 at this point. God is very serious about this. You know, put the boundary stones out there. Don't let any person or animal come up on the mountain, or it will be a disaster. And so that there are going to be some specific occasions where he does allow people up on the mountain, but in the case of like the general people, he says no. Okay? So again, this chapter I find interesting because not only do you have in here some great application as far as us understanding the character of God, his power, his authority, even his tender care of the people, trying to make sure they are protected so that they don't come up and experience wrath. God's character is revealed in several new ways in this section. But then also just the amount of respect that God indicates he expects the people to have for him, right? To consecrate yourself for 3 days, that don't approach the mountain on penalty of death. Make sure that you are respecting what is happening here. I think there's a lot of value and application to draw from that. Lisa? So yes, I do. Yeah, I think it's back and forth personally. I don't know that means he went to the tippy top. Okay? There is one point where it says go to the top of the mountain, but the rest of them just come up on the mountain. And so I kind of wonder if there's not and again, this does not necessarily mean it is a massive mountain. You know, this isn't I don't think the Mount Sinai you have at the tip of Sinai Peninsula, which is a very treacherous and tall mountain. This is one of the mountains in Midian, and those mountains weren't nearly as big. And so it would have been a trek, but it would have been, probably not like climbing Everest or anything. Like there's nothing like that going on. Yep. Yeah, and so just that idea of creating separation, that's the last point actually that I want to make from this chapter, which is just even though God is starting a relationship with these people, is it the same kind of personal relationship that God establishes in the new covenant? Not at all. There is clearly separation. And in this case, there's several degrees of separation. Like, we're going to have the people down here, we're going to have boundary stones in place, we're going to have a long trek up a mountain, and then only one person at this point is allowed to even come up and have any sort of communication with God, unless God chooses to speak to the people. And so you've got that distance that is created, but that distance helps them to understand respect. And I think that's important to emphasize here in this chapter. Keith and then Ron.
I was thinking the same thing. How do we reconcile, or not reconciliation, but how much of this separation would you say is due to God's character, your respect to him, versus the difference in covenant from old versus new, and maybe even in the maturity of the people engaged in it?
I think it's 100% covenant. God, if it were a character-based issue, well, then it would still be true. Because God's character does not change. He is perfect. He has been the same yesterday, today, and forever. So God's character remains the same. The covenant changed. And this was a covenant, a very physical covenant that was designed to give people a connection point with God. That's very different than God dwelling in us, which is what we have in the new covenant, as we talked about on Sunday. So that makes a big difference there between the two. Ron?
This story here, plus later on with the tabernacle, really illustrates how important approaching God is really the major thing. Here's the physical approach to God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's illustrated even more with the tabernacle where you just visualize the way that was set up with a courtyard established around it. You have the Levites designated on three sides
Mm-hmm.
before the rest of the tribes.
Yeah.
On the other side. And then on the entrance to the courtyard, you've got Moses there. But then you have the priests who go into the courtyard to do their sacrifices. And then a smaller group of priests can go in and do the incense burning, and only the high priest can do the interment. So
Yeah.
you have this layered.
Yep.
And then you contrast that with Hebrews, encouraged to approach God now boldly.
Yep. Boldly come before the throne of grace. Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me, I point this passage out probably more than I should, but it reminds me of Ecclesiastes 5. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Better to approach in obedience than to offer the sacrifice as fools do, for they ignorantly do wrong. Do not be hasty to speak, and do not be impulsive to make a speech before God. God is in heaven, you are on earth, so let your words be few. Just that idea of, remember, God belongs there, we're here. There's a distance, according to the writer of Ecclesiastes. Now, I think some of that is taken care of in the new covenant. But it still does emphasize the amount of respect that is needed when going before God. Keith?
There's a lesson in there where Moses asked him, it's a legitimate question. Why do I need to go back down and tell him? I know that I was supposed to cut up.
Yeah.
But God didn't give, he didn't owe him an explanation.
Yeah.
He just, and you do what God said, and sometimes you may not have an explanation, but you still do what God said.
Yeah.
And he didn't question it, and we told him he went.
Yeah.
And that's the way we have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Obedience, whether you understand or not. So, but that does bring us to chapter 20, which is the Ten Commandments, and we're not going to spend a ton of time there, although I want to, because I love picking apart the Ten Commandments. Maybe there's a sermon series coming on that. Maybe. But the idea of the Ten Commandments here, what I love about the Ten Commandments, though, is the very first phrase of chapter 20. Then God spoke all these words. Okay, you remember back in chapter 19, God said, I'm going to speak to the people from this dense cloud that I'm going to send. Here's what he says. Okay, God spoke all these words. The people knew what God wanted. So God says, I am God. You can have no other gods before me. You shall not make any idols for yourself. You shall not misuse my name or use my name in a disrespectful manner. You got to remember the Sabbath day and keep that day holy. Why is that day holy according to this giving of the Ten Commandments? Do what? Okay. Yeah, it's based on creation. So God made in 6 days, rested on the seventh, so the seventh day is made holy. I point that out because when you get over to Deuteronomy, a different reason is given. And we might focus in on that when we get over there, if I remember that that's what we're supposed to focus in on. And then we got number 5, honor your father and mother. Number 6, do not kill. Number 7, do not commit adultery. Number 8, do not steal. Number 9, do not give false testimony or speak truthfully about your neighbor. And then number 17, do not covet. Okay, do not want the things that belong elsewhere. Now, again, we might have a sermon series coming on those because I do love to talk about those, but I know I don't have time to do so tonight. But what I do want to focus in on is the people's reaction to the Ten Commandments. Their reaction is they trembled. They shook in their boots, right? And said, you speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us or we will die. Okay, I've heard people debate as to whether this was delivered to the people or whether God said it. God said it. The people heard it. Every Israelite knew these 10 commandments, and I would imagine they were hard to forget when you heard them spoken by God himself, right? And that plays an important role when you see them start to break these 10 commandments pretty quickly in the story. But they knew, they were scared of this. But I love what Moses says in verse 20. Don't be afraid, for God has come to test you so that you will fear him and not sin. Why is God giving them such an incredible display of power and authority? What's God's motivations? He like making people scared? He's like that kid that likes to hide in the bushes and jump out at people and then laugh at them. Well, why, Keith?
It's because the violation of these laws, sin itself, is separating God from his creation.
Yes.
This is serious to God. This is personal to God. He needs them to understand. You know, we're not told exactly how he delivered the timbre of his voice when he delivered that first, that command.
It was very deep and low. It's kind of
To Adam in Genesis, right, in the beginning. But here, as he's trying to establish a covenant with his people after, having to kick out Adam and Eve, I think that's, part of the reason that it's so, not in face.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to note that, like Keith is saying, God understands the seriousness of the laws that he's given. And you see that in the giving of the 10 Commandments. Look back in verse 5. He speaks of punishing the children for their father's iniquity. Verse 7, will not leave unpunished someone who misuses his name. Verse 12, if you do this, you'll have a long life, which the implication is if you don't do it, you will have a shortened life of some sort. Just even in the 10 Commandments, you've got the principle of obey or be punished. And God understands what that is and what those punishments are and how severe it will be. And so God is telling them from the get-go, take this seriously. And we've got to make sure that we understand that even in these 10 Commandments. Keith? Yeah. Well, and again, I think part of the difference is when we choose to disobey the law, we are choosing to depart from the blessings of God. And when you don't have the blessings of God, you're kind of left to whatever horrible thing can happen. And so you've got that issue here. So Moses goes and receives additional laws. We've got laws about slavery and the good treatment of slaves, and even the idea of right here with the giving of the law, right after the giving of the 10 Commandments, this principle of the piercing of the ear, and making the lifelong commitment to the master. I think that's on purpose. Here there's the implication that masters should be the kind of masters that are worth making a lifetime commitment to. And so you've got that. Laws about personal injury. If someone does some ugly thing to someone else, these are the consequences for those actions, and these are the people who will be punished. Laws about theft over in chapter 22. The idea that they were to be an honest people and to respect other people's property and make sure that they are treating one another well. Laws about crop protection, the idea of, whenever they have a field or a vineyard, animals, if they go and graze someone else's field, well, then there needs to be repayment for that. And so there's a lot of laws about fairness and equity. You've got laws about personal property, which are similar to the previous. Just that idea of when someone has property, if someone else violates that property, then there must be repayment for that. There must be some sort of justice involved there. Laws about sexual sins down in chapter 22, verse 16. And so the idea of somebody who is promiscuous, what the consequences of that are. Capital offense laws. If someone is letting the sorceress practice her magical arts, well, that is punishable. Anyone who engages in sex with animals, that is punishable by death. Anyone who sacrifices to the gods other than God alone, they are to be put to death. Laws for protecting the vulnerable, you're going to see that a lot through the laws of God. God has always shown himself to be concerned about the orphans, the widows, the destitute, those who are struggling. God has always been one who sets up laws to protect those people. And then verse 28, you've got some sort of repetition here. You must not blaspheme God or curse a leader among your people. I've always found that one interesting. Okay? Because what do you see a lot of as we move forward in Israel's story? They do a lot of cursing their leaders. But here we've got that being a specific command that's mentioned. Make sure you give your offerings. Be my holy people, God tells them there in verse 31. Laws about honesty and justice, making sure that they're doing lawsuits properly, that they're seeking justice in the way that justice works. Sabbath festivals, he talks about that briefly. You've got promises and warnings about God was going to go before the people. He was going to win their battles for them. He was going to protect them whenever they went into their promised land. Verse 27, I will cause the people ahead of you to feel terror, and I will throw into confusion all the nations you come to. Now again, I find that interesting, because how much do the people believe in that when they get to the promised land? Not at all. You want to know why Joshua and Caleb knew that God would win? Stuff like that. Because that's what God promised he would do. Yet, when Joshua was leading, still they struggle with it, including Joshua a little bit. We'll talk about that when we get to Joshua's story. But you... Yeah.
You're accountable for whatever you do, whether it's by accident or whether it's on purpose. You're accountable.
Yep. Absolutely. And again, those are in a lot of ways the hallmarks of a well-functioning society. You gotta have accountability, you gotta have justice. One of the things you see falling apart in our current society is a lack of accountability among citizens and a dismissal of justice for the sake of personal gain. When those two things aren't there, you have a society that is not going to hold up and it's not going to function. And so God understands that as he's establishing these people as a community, as a nation that is going to serve him. He is giving them the laws that honestly aren't that dissimilar from the other cultures around them. That is one thing I think we probably don't appreciate enough, because we've done a lot of study in the Bible. We've done very little study in other ancient cultures. But you'll find a lot of similarities between the law of God and the laws that were already established in other cultures, like eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. That is a principle of justice, right? That was a common standard of punishment in most ancient Near Eastern cultures. Most of them. And so the judgment, I mean, that's still the common sense way we do it today. For a while there was a court show that I can't remember what it was called, People's Court or something, but it was a court show where the judge would mete out punishments that were similar to the crime that was created, but they were like creative ways for that person to essentially pay back the harm that they did. But it was, and you had to agree that you would agree to whatever the judge decided, and you were accountable, and if not, there was some sort of consequence or something like that. But it was very much an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth judgment. Okay, no grace. Very much okay, you did this thing, well, you're going to do this other thing in order to pay back the first thing you did. That's justice. That's what makes sense to us. And so anytime we have a society, it has to have that sort of standard or foundation in order to function. Keith?
I'm a legal nerd, so I'll so Moses appears 8 times in the ceiling of the Supreme Court here in our country. And that's because we built the Supreme Court building. We recognize just how incredible these laws were.
Yeah.
Like you said, many of them weren't dissimilar from surrounding nations, but one of the areas that stuck out to me in my study is God's emphasis on taking care of the vulnerable, and especially women.
Yeah.
In through these laws. It doesn't feel like that with our modern sensibilities, but throughout a lot of these laws, you see God making sure that person will be made, and that was not often present.
Well, and I will say that is one of the areas in which the Bible's standard of justice was significantly different than other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Women were property. That was the way it was handled in ancient Near Eastern cultures. The Bible treats women like people. Okay? Now, again, we don't necessarily, in our modern sentiment, like the way it talks about what should happen to women. For instance, you go back and look at chapter 22 and verse 20 or verse 16. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and he sleeps with her, he must certainly pay the bridal price for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must pay an amount in silver equal to the bridal price for a virgin. And we're like, no, he should be punished. Well, that our modern sentiment says that. But in ancient Near Eastern cultures, she would have just been his. There really wouldn't have been any sort of repayment. And so the idea of giving women this exalted status as if they matter was a big deal in biblical, the way the Bible presents all that. All right, let me get through just the first part here of 24 so we can stay on track and I can still have my claim to fame for the quarter. First 11 verses of chapter 24, which again is one of those fascinating pieces of the story. Moses says, all right, you're going to bring some people, or God says, you're going to bring some people up on the mountain with you, okay? You and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, who are they? Aaron's sons, very good. And 70 of Israel's elders, and bow and worship at a distance. Moses alone is to approach the Lord, but the others are not to approach, and the people are not to go up with him. All right, Moses came, told the people all that the commands of the Lord, all the ordinances. Then all the people responded with a single voice, we'll do everything that the Lord has commanded. They don't. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early the next morning, set an altar and 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel at the base of the mountains. And he set out young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half the blood, set it in basins, the other half the blood he splattered on the altar. Then he took the covenant scroll, and read it aloud to the people. They responded, we will do and obey all that the Lord has commanded. Again, I laugh in their faces. Moses took the blood, splattered it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you concerning all these words. Where have we heard that phrase before? Emmeline just pointed with her pinky finger at the Lord's Supper table. So I'm going to take that as an answer, the Lord's Supper. All right, that is the phrase used for the cup in the Lord's Supper, right? That this is the blood of the covenant. We often think of it, this is the blood, and we're like, it's another part of the physical suffering of Jesus. It's not. What Jesus is pointing to is this, that it is that the cup is to remind us of our covenant. It's to remind us of the agreement. Just like here, Moses is making an agreement and essentially signing on the dotted line by sprinkling blood on the people in the altar. That is essentially what the blood of the covenant at the Lord's Supper is to remind us of. We have been sprinkled with the blood of Christ. We have been put into a covenant relationship. We have a responsibility to him the same way these Israelites had a responsibility to their God. So it is more a reminder of the agreement that we agreed to when we became Christians. Okay? So don't let that pass by as you think through the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Okay? Next couple of verses here. Verse 9, then Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the Israel's elders, and they saw the God of Israel. Beneath his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as clear as the sky itself. God did not harm the Israelite nobles. They saw him, and they ate and drank. Wowzers. Yeah, Dallas.
Compare this description to Revelation 4. John's description of the throne scene, pavement of blue.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't say that John was seeing a vision at this point. And it doesn't say these elders were seeing a vision.
No.
They saw the pavement of blue under John's feet.
Well, and again, I think it's significant that it says God didn't kill him. Well, why would God have killed him? Well, that was the understanding. You saw God, you died, right? That's said later to Moses. But in this case, God made an exception and let these people see him in some form or manner. I know later on it says no one has seen God at any time except the one sent by him in John chapter 1. But here we've got this story that says they came and ate and drank in the presence of God, and just what an incredible experience that would have been. Okay, Ron?
It's safe to say that they didn't see his face.
Maybe so. Maybe they saw his feet, but he was so tall, the rest of him was hidden, and the clouds even higher than that. I don't know. All we know is they saw him. What did they see of him? It doesn't describe all that. It describes his surroundings more than it describes him, right? And maybe they could have seen him, but they were all so amazed that all they looked at was his feet, which is why they could see his feet was on something like lapis lazuli, because they couldn't bring themselves to lift their eyes any higher than that. That's what I like to think. Okay, but just what an amazing, it's just an unimaginable experience that would have been.
And none of this select group of people, for one reason or another, made
That's absolutely true, which, again, amazing. So we'll pick up there on track on Sunday. So.